thank you so much for coming. We are so happy to see you.
Artist Joe Mathieu grew up looking at illustrations in the Saturday Evening Post and Life magazine, as well as Mad magazine, which made an important impression on his thinking as well. As a boy, he had drawing contests with his father, and his mother served as the judge. And he found inspiration in the work of Norman Rockwell and many other noted illustrators of that period. Joe created caricatures of the teachers and fellow students at his school, some of which appreciated that and some of whom did not. He later attended the Rhode Island School of Design, and after graduation, he launched his freelance career illustrating stories and books for Houghton Mifflin, Atlantic Little Brown, and McGraw-Hill, among others. His big break came in 1972 when Random House began publishing books for Sesame Street, and he became adept at capturing the expressive qualities of Muppet characters and the look and feel of the television show, which launched in 1969. This led to long relationships with Random House and Sesame Workshop that continue to this day. In addition to numerous books for Sesame Street, Joe has also created thousands of illustrations and designs for all sorts of Sesame Street products, from an extensive line of clothing to interactive toys and games. He's also enjoyed illustrating hundreds of features for Sesame Street magazine. Did you guys get Sesame Street magazine? In 1974, Joe wrote and illustrated Big Joe's Trailer Truck, which has been translated into several languages and is considered a classic today. He's authored several books and has also had the honor of illustrating books by all the great writers of Sesame Street, including Norman Stiles, Lou Berger, and John Stone. In addition to Sesame Street, he has illustrated books written by such well-known authors as Laura Numeroff, Marlo Thomas, and even Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel. To date, Joe Mathieu has illustrated over 150 children's books for many publishers, and he has collaborated as co-illustrator with artist Aristides Ruiz on a series of new Cat in the Hat books for Penguin Random House. Joe's love of ragtime and piano, as well as jazz of the 1920s, eventually led him to illustrate album and CD covers. And thank you to one of our guests, where are you? Thank you for bringing in examples of that work, which we have here, and which you'll show, I hope, okay? Mm-hmm. So that is extremely special. He's illustrated covers for such bands as the New Black Evil Jazz Band from Massachusetts, the South Frisco Band from California, the Turk Murphy Jazz Band from California, the Paris Washboard Jazz Band from France, the Humphrey Littleton Jazz Band from England, and many others. An example of Joe's original artwork is on view here at the museum, right upstairs in our exhibition galleries in Woodstock to the Moon. So if you haven't seen that, it's really special. It is both a tribute to Norman Rockwell and his beloved Sesame Workshop. So we are so honored to have you with us, Joe. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jen. Well, thanks. Well, I first went to New York to look for work when I was 22 years old. I suppose when you look at me, you assume I was always this age. I was just a kid when I first went to New York, just out of art school, married, and ready to see what I could do with. And basically, I always wanted to be an illustrator. I never had thoughts about being a fine artist or a painter or anything other than being an illustrator, because I just loved illustration. I just loved Norman Rockwell and Jack Davis and all these people. And there was no plan B. I was going to do this, and that was it, period. And at the time when I started, I suspect it's still this way, but I'm not sure, you were a freelance illustrator, meaning there are no job opportunities for you. you are an independent contractor and unemployable for life. And that's the way it's been. And actually, I welcomed the challenge, and I went to New York. It was 1971. So even though Sesame Street started 50 years ago in '69, they didn't actually produce books for 2 years or so in 1971, which coincided happily with my arrival in the city of New York. And looking for work could be fun. I met some interesting people. It was great. Or it could be awful. One of my most memorable interviews was with a guy, I believe it was at Dell Publishing. And I walked into this impressive penthouse office, and this big man, very impressive guy with big lapels and big hands. And he looked at my portfolio, and he was turning the pieces faster and faster than I can say what they were. And I didn't have a good feeling about this. And when I finished, he just folded those hands, and he finally said to me, "Who the heck do you think you are?" And I didn't see that coming at all. And he said, do you realize how difficult it is to make it in this field? He said, there are people who are really great and developed. And back in 1971, he had a Rolodex, which he pointed to with that big hand. And he said, I have every illustrator in New York's name in that Rolodex. I can call any of them. He said, I can call Jack Davis. Why would I call you? And I more or less thanked him for his advice and time, and left completely shattered. But, you know, he was right. And what I eventually figured out is that you have to be good, and you have to really apply yourself. And I know that when I talk to people students who ask me about this, and I say, well, freelance illustration is kind of what you have to do. And they say, well, no, that's too dangerous, it's too risky. I'll do it part-time. And I tried it part-time, and you can't do it part-time. It's a little bit like saying, I want to play baseball for the Red Sox or the Yankees. You pick the team. But I'm going to do it part-time. You're never going to make it, because your competition is the best in the world, and they do it full-time. So you're going to have to just swallow this pill, and no plan B, you may not make it. But there you go. So I used to have like I said, the portfolio. I was dressed to the nines. I had big wide bottom pants in 1971 and blue suede shoes, and a pocket full of change so that I could use a phone booth. Quaint idea. And I'd get up in the morning, I'd call every art director that I could get on the phone and try to fill my day with appointments. And a lot of times I got stood up or told off or whatever it was. But I'd leave my sample, no matter how badly it went. It was difficult to spend your last dime getting there only to be told the art director won't see you. But instead of storming out, I would say, well, would you kindly give the art director my sample? Which was a Hias drawing with my name and phone number on it. And eventually, one of those that stood me up kept the sample. And when they were looking for people to draw, for someone to capture whatever they were looking for at Sesame Street, they said, has anyone interesting been in there lately? And they said, wait a minute. There's this guy, and his phone number is on the... So I got calls from Sesame Street. And yes, the good old days in New York. So eventually I got some attention at Sesame Street. And when I first started drawing the Muppets, I thought, well, I was a huge Muppet fan, by the way. Absolutely enamored of the Muppets. And the first thing I was asked to do was several monsters. It was one of these things is different from the others. And there were 3 monsters, and I think all the other groupings were 4. So the 3 was the tip-off. It's the monsters. So I drew these Muppet monsters, and they were just awful. And I thought, I'm so glad. I'll be able to say for the rest of my life that I actually drew the Muppets. It's one time, and I'm sure they'll never hire me again. And they came back the next month at Sesame Street magazine, and they hired me again. And I eventually started to get the hang of it. So, oh, gee, I had to show you this. The sample that I used to leave was from a book. My first book assignment was called Casey's Camper. It's a funky little book that didn't really do much except to help me start my career. And the first time I attempted to develop the characters, they were very cute and kind of conservative and careful. And the publisher said, no, forget it. Someday we'll have something for you, but go away. And so I said, well, look, I'll do another one and I'll send it to you. No, you don't waste your time, basically. No, I'm going to send it to you. So you don't have to open the package if you don't want. Just put it in the trash when you get it, but I'm going to send it to you. So I went out on a limb and did something a little crazy. Well, it was published, and the New York Times Book Review wrote an article about the new breed of children's book illustrators, calling me and my contemporaries street smart young illustrators who break all the rules. I was so flattered. I was so not street smart. And as far as breaking the rules, I didn't even know what the rules were. I was just looking for work, So this is Casey's Camper. It's a two-color job. Back then, sometimes they only had money for two colors. So this is just the pencil and some yellow. And Old Man Casey, where I broke the rules. This was the one they printed in the New York Times Book Review. They're looking for a place to park their camper. Look at these hideous people. And they ran across a hunter. They met a hunter. And he said, you can't park your camper here. Well, instead of just drawing a hunter walking innocently through the woods, he blasts himself in with a double-barrel shotgun, of course, risking everyone in the world and just flying through the air like that. And that was breaking the rules. So that one got me to Sesame Street because I was so street smart and a rule breaker. So when I was finally asked to do some illustrations for Random House, for the first Muppet books, Sesame Street Muppet books, I did some rough sketches, and the art director there I just loved. His name was Michael Frith, and he was my idol. I just thought he was the coolest guy I'd ever met. He was tall and had a beard, and he said, how would you like to meet the Muppets? We're going to because at that time, Jim Henson was the only one that looked at the drawings and could approve them. This is before there was any art department or any style books. There were no style books. There was nothing to go on. Somebody gave me a couple of photographs. They'd put a Muppet on a pole, and he'd be kind of dead like that, and you had to they'd take a photograph and send it to me. So it was ridiculous. So he said, we're going to go meet the Muppets today. Well, we went up to the Muppets, which was basically an old carriage shed on the Upper East Side of New York. And we went up a long stairway. And at the top of the stairway, it was absolute magic. I remember one of the first things I noticed was a wooden table, small table, had 3 legs. And the legs were carved, they're wood. They were carved. They were little skinny human legs with big human feet at the bottom of them. And I knew this was going to be a great place. So we went in, and the first person I met was sitting at a workbench, and he was an elderly man with white hair, a white ponytail, and a white beard. And he had a big bird head on the workbench, and he was making a new big bird head. And he was making the eyelids open and close and the beak and work. And I thought, this is great. This man's name was Kermit Love. What a great name. And he couldn't have been nicer, and he looked at the sketches, and he wanted to put his 2 cents in. And in the corner, there was about a 15 to 20 foot tall Muppet. I think they call it a rod puppet, because the man in a black suit would stand in the darkness and have these big rods, and this giant thing would walk around with feathers flying and everything. I thought, this place is great. The next day, guy who came up the stairs had long hair. He looked very hippie-ish in a Hawaiian shirt. And his name was Carol Spinney. And this is Big Bird. And he was very happy to meet me, and turns out he knew my father, which is a different story. I don't know if I'll have time to get to this, but he was actually suing my father. It's a small world, you know. But my dad was a car dealer, and Carol was a customer. And anyway, he said, by the way, he said, are you related to the Joe Mathieu? And I said, yes, Carol. Anyway, he couldn't have been nicer, and over the years, he was great to me and the kids and everything when we'd go to the set. Wonderful human being and a fantastic performer. This guy, who was probably no taller than I am, embodied a character who was 8 foot 2 inches tall. And he could ride a unicycle in this costume, or roller skates. And on the inside, he couldn't really see out. He had a monitor strapped to his chest, and he couldn't see like through Big Bird's eyes or anything. He saw what the camera saw him doing. So he wasn't sure if he was going to ride just in front of the brownstone on Sesame Street or right into it. And he did both many times. And of course, his arm is straight up in the air, holding that huge head and working the eyes and the mouth and everything. He was just amazing, but I thought all these guys were amazing. So I met Carol. He wanted to look at the sketches, and he had some suggestions for me as well. So from there, we went next door. It turned out that there was a photo session going on, and all the Muppets were there on these stands, on these metal pipey stand things that they'd stick the Muppets on and pose them, a little bit like Cookie Monster is down upstairs, only not done as artfully as this one is. But they're setting them all up for a calendar, and there's a photographer there with photographs, and he was great. He had this big knife and this apple. I mean, he looked like a pirate or something, and he's taking these photos of the Muppets, and it was just magical. And who came in but Jim Henson? And he was such a nice guy, and he looked at the sketches. Here there was a guy who was supposed to look at the sketches, and he liked what I was doing. Well, I told him, I really want to learn to do this right. And there's just no way I can study them unless I see them more often and get to be comfortable with them. He said, is there any way you can set this up? And he was so impressed. He said, absolutely. He said, you can have access to the Muppet morgue whenever you want to. You just call so-and-so and she'll let you in. So they actually had this room, and it looked just like a morgue. It had big drawers with a handle on each drawer and a name like Kermit or Ernie and Bert and all that. And you'd pull out the drawer, and there he was. And I was allowed to go there, and I took full advantage of this. I used to go in. Sometimes my wife would accompany me. We'd take photos, and I'd do sketches, and we'd take the Muppets out and play with them. And it was great. Now, that's how you find out how little talent you have as a puppeteer. But what a wonderful opportunity to see these close up and get a feel for the balance and how everything moved and worked in them. And they were surprisingly simply built in some ways, and yet they worked so well. They were just amazing. And they would wear out because they're under the hot lights, and the performers would sweat. And these things would rot, and they'd have to be remade all the time. So when I see one somewhere in a museum or something in a glass case, he always looks so moth-eaten kind of and sweaty. But that was great. And so at this photo session, the one guy who I haven't met finally showed up was Frank Oz. Frank Oz was the one that you would know from later on Miss Piggy, but Bert, Cookie Monster, and Grover. Not to mention any hefty voice, and eventually Yoda in the Star Wars movies. So Frank Oz came in. He had been on vacation. Everyone says, Frank, so he'd been gone for a couple of weeks. Welcome back, Frank. How's it going? And he sits, and there's Grover on this stand, looking horrible. And he went over, Grover, and he put Grover on. And when he put Grover on his arm, it's like lights entered his eyes, and life came into his body, and he became lifelike, independent from Frank. Frank's looking over there, and Grover's looking over there, you know, and Grover's been asleep for a couple of weeks, so he's looking around, familiarize himself, like, where are we? And I just thought that was the craziest thing. And when I saw the show upstairs, if you get a chance, on one of the walls there are some black and white photographs of the Muppets being performed. And there's a picture of Frank Oz with Grover on. And he's looking over here, and there's a little TV monitor so that they can see what they're doing on the monitor. Grover's looking at the monitor. And it's a little bit like what I'm trying to describe. He has his own life. And when I was absolutely entranced, and I looked at him, and all of a sudden you can see the wheels thinking in his head. And he says, Frank, he whispers to Frank to get his attention. And Frank says, yes, Grover. And Grover says, Frank, you promised me that when you left to go on vacation, no one would put anything up there. Talking about the stand. Well, we all thought that was pretty funny. So that was my introduction to the Muppets. So we eventually got into doing some nice books and doing all kinds of things, doing a line of clothing and a lot of toys and all kinds of things. But the books were the thing for me, basically. And I started off using pen and ink, actually, and coloring that. But I felt that the pen and ink was a bit harsh for such soft, furry, and plush characters. So I moved on to a softer line with a Prismacolor pencil, but I stayed with the same watercolors, and that's pretty much what I stayed with through the end. Jim finally couldn't do the blue lining and the approvals anymore as he got more and more busy and famous. So he started to hire people, and he actually hired me to do blue lining at first. I think I was one of his first blue liners, but that isn't really what I wanted to do. I wanted to do the finished art. So I got out of that, and at around that time, he actually offered me a job. I never saw this coming. I'm a freelance illustrator. I don't get work. I don't have a job. I don't get a paycheck. And I thought, my God, this is amazing. I'm going to be a Muppet. This is fantastic. And I thought about it, and it drove me crazy, and I turned the job down. At that point, I was starting to do a lot of books. I liked being the illustrator. I realized that that's what I always wanted to do. I always knew that. I wanted to be a freelance illustrator, book illustrator. And I was one, and I didn't want to give that up. So I actually chose to be a freelance illustrator for the first time, which I thought was great. I wasn't no longer stuck with being a freelancer. I chose it. So here I was, a proud freelance illustrator. And so the work itself, I always felt that with a book, I always felt that being a book illustrator means, for me, that the book is the final finished product, not the artwork. So to me, I'm not making nice drawings that you can frame and hang on the wall, and while you're at it, scan them and make a book out of it. To me, the book is the finished product. And a lot of times, especially with the early days of more primitive printing techniques and financial concerns, the color was done on one piece of paper and the line was done on another paper. So you never really had it together as a single unit anyway. You never saw it complete until it was published and you opened the book up and you saw how it looked. So that informed me. And as I think I've heard people say that, like especially like Norman Rockwell, he worked so huge. Look at those originals upstairs. They're way bigger than they have to be. Like generally, if a page is this big, let's say Life or the Post magazine is this big, you might do it up a little bit. You might do it the same size, or you might do it if you go 150%, 1.5. That's huge. Norman Rockwell's doing 300% or more. I don't know what those actually are percentage-wise, but I think that's why he's actually a painter too, because he was doing paintings that were illustrations, and they stand up very well in a museum setting. You know, they're great and they're huge, and they exist as paintings, not just as illustrations. I just do illustrations. To me, the book is the finished product. So in these simple things, or even these, you might see, I think the color on these was done separately from the black line. That's while I was still working with pen and ink, and the color was done on a separate piece of paper. And I think that was one of my very first big birds, which got some attention from Jim Henson and sort of made me a career. This one was actually, I did not illustrate the whole book. I illustrated one of 4 stories. And I was thrilled because one of the other illustrators was Ed Koren, who was one of my idols from the New Yorker. And Stan Mack was another one. He was a cartoonist who was considered very hip in those days. And I illustrated Fisherman's, and there's not a Muppet in this story. So I started off doing this. And this is, if you look at the style of this compared to Casey's Camper, it's the same thing. This was done almost simultaneous with that at the same time. So, and the color was done separately from the line as well. In fact, the color was done in black and white. I never even saw the color. It's a complicated process, but so as far as the process of illustrating, I always had the feeling that the cover of a book was actually a poster, in a sense. It didn't go anywhere. It announces the story. It announces the book. And it has to be designed like a cover, like a magazine cover or like a poster. And it doesn't move so much as to capture your attention and command the cover spot. The interior illustrations, I want them to move. I want them to bring you from left to right, the direction that we read in, and the way we turn the pages. I want you to want to turn the page, which is different from the cover. And so I think my style evolved over time where I think at first I was trying to paint every piece of fur on a monster, for example. And that didn't flow as easily as if you insinuated something softer and had more movement. I wanted the characters to move, and I wanted them to move from left to right. And so I actually did less fur painting and more just general, softer movement sort of thing. And I think I was known as having a lot of movement in my style. And that's what worked for me, and that's the way I like to work. The other thing, it's a stupid little detail, but I think it's instructive, is that my light source, I always made it from the upper right. And I remember talking with other illustrators about that, and they said, "You do? Mine's always upper left." Well, why is yours upper left? I don't remember what they said, but I know why mine was upper right, because if I'm trying to make all the action go from left to right, they're facing the right. So I want the light to be illuminating their faces. It's very simple. But a little thing like that is something we don't always think of, you know. And I always started small. Maybe a double-page spread would be this big. That way I could lay the whole book out in front of me, like playing cards, and I could control that movement. I could see that everything's going from left to right. And you're a director. You're controlling the camera angles. This is a close-up. This is a bird's eye view. This is an oddball angle. And you keep control of all that. You spin around the room. So you're Alfred Hitchcock or whatever you want to be, Fellini. And you have control. And then you enlarge it and you do the rough sketch full size. And from there, you can either do the finish full size or up from that. And those are just some thoughts about illustrating books that I think are different from illustrating other things, like album covers. I didn't expect to talk about album covers today. But one of the things that obviously I was working hard. I was working till 3 in the morning. You know, I was burning out. I had an agent. He said, "Mr. Mathieu, you're burning out." He said, "You've got to start quitting at a reasonable hour, and you've got to get out, and you've got to start doing other things." I did 2 things from there. I started riding a bicycle, which saved my life. I love riding a bicycle. I'm still an avid cyclist. And I became a jazz fan. And being a jazz fan, you know, I couldn't help myself. The next thing you know, I'm pestering the band to do their album covers. The New Black Eagle Jazz Band in particular, which Mr. Eli Neuberger was the tuba player for the band. So I used to be all over them to draw their, and up to that point they'd been using photos, and it all seemed weird, but somehow I eventually ended up doing some covers for them. And Eli brought along some of the silly covers that I drew. But the nice thing about doing a cover like this is that it's a one-shot deal. When you illustrate a children's book, it's 32 pages or more, sometimes 60 pages, sometimes a couple hundred pages. But here I can try something for one 12 or 12 and a half or whatever it is inch square. Later with CDs, it wasn't as much fun. But I used to love doing these. You're welcome to come up. This is a little more realistic, you know, illustrative style. Depending on the personality of the band or musician and the style of music they play, you know, that kind of determines your approach. This was a crazy French band. They used to actually play, they didn't play in a club, they played on a railroad, in a railroad station for tips, in the Gare de Lyon, which is the train station of Lyon that goes to Lyon. And so I've got Mayhem on the Train going on in their banjo case where they collected the tips and that sort of thing. And this was another French band. This was one of my favorite covers, actually. Jazz Battle. And this is the New Black Eagle Jazz Band, one I did for them. So things were moving right along. I was illustrating books like crazy. I even wrote a book which was mentioned earlier, Big Joe's Trailer Truck, which was translated into a dozen languages or something like that. And I still get fan mail for this, even though it's out of print. You can get an e-book, but I was very proud of this. This was a very popular book. This was, and I wrote a few books. And in fact, for Sesame Street, I became familiar enough with the characters in the show where sometimes they would give me a concept. And they would just say, here's what we want. We want one page about counting, one page about colors, one page about the city, one page about the country. And they just list these things, and I'd go home and I'd just draw. And then I'd come in and I'd give them the drawings, and they'd write something. I'd leave a little space, and they might put a few lines in. So there's no real author, no real story. So I would get credit as the author of the book, even though I didn't write anything. But I composed it, I guess you could say. And things were moving right along. You know, I was getting projects like that, which were real sweet. There's a book called Big Bird's Big Book. It's this tall. It's this wide, opens to this wide. And this was all completely improvised with no manuscript. And I loved doing that. We had just taken a trip around the country. I could have done anything with this book, but I managed to satisfy these requests for different concepts based on our trip around the country. So you'd see a national park, or you'd see redwood trees, or you'd see the desert, and you'd see all these things. And it was all done to a small book scale. So the characters are only this big, even though the pages were this big. So you had a lot of characters. And one of my editors at the time, he was one of my favorite editors. His name was Ole Riesem. He was from Denmark. He was Danish royalty, and he really knew art. And he told me to study Bruegel, the Flemish painter. I think there was a father and a son Bruegel. I always get them mixed up. But he used to do these busy scenes of old Europe festivals. There'd be a little crucifixion going on in the corner and the birth of Christ over there, and they're having a winter festival, they're ice skating, all going on in the same thing. And he was great. And so I made all these Bruegels for Sesame Street, basically, and it was just the right thing. I think they have one of my books up in the bookshop. It's called We're Different, We're the Same. And it's all about people being different and being the same. It's about different cultures and different types and everything else. And those are all Bruegels, if you look at them. Every other page. One page has little snapshots of eyes and noses and different things. And then you open it up to see all those people interacting in a huge park scene or city scene or whatever it is. And that bird's eye view point of view is very difficult to draw because you can't hide anything. You have to draw everything. But Ole always demanded a lot of work, but he was a great editor. So this was going great until one day, somewhere around, I think it was 1998. I think the guy's name was Spencer Johnson, who wrote a book called Who Moved My Cheese? Because someone moved my damn cheese. All of a sudden, my whole world fell apart, and the digital world had taken over. Now the publishers only wanted digital art. And I didn't know how to send an email. So I decided I read the book, I got all psyched up, went out and bought a computer, and fell flat on my face. I just didn't know what to make of it. I eventually bought a book called How to Work Digitally, How to Do Illustration with a Computer, or something clever like that, written by John Ennis. And this was a guy who was a photorealistic illustrator, almost like Norman Rockwell, but he did romance novel covers, that sort of thing. But he was very, very talented. And he went from analog, as they call it, to digital. And just reading his account of what he went through and how he accomplished this with Photoshop gave me a whole new perspective. And I sought help, and I learned how to do it. And to this day, I currently have no drawing table in my studio. I have a computer, and I do all my work on a computer at this point. And can you tell the difference? Well, it's a different look. I think if I wanted to really try to copy the old look, I could probably do it. As a matter of fact, when they did the digital version of Big Joe's Trailer Truck, they lost the artwork for the cover. I redid the cover digitally. You can't tell the difference. So you can do it. But, so since 2002, I've been working digitally. And, you know, the thing is, like, I'm getting older. I used to love the old days when I'd have my big, fat portfolio and bring it into the city with a finished book in it. And I'd go up to the publisher, and I'd all be all dressed up, and I'd open this, and we'd lay the artwork all out, and everyone would cheer, and we'd all go out and eat French food and get drunk. It was great, and we'd talk about the next book, and that's how you did it. You know, you'd keep the momentum going. Now, I don't even know most of the people that I work with. I've never met them. I've never spoken on the phone with them. It's all done through email and that sort of thing. And I upload the art. I don't bring it into the city any longer. And it's all weird, and it's diminished in a lot of ways. But that's the state of the art. If you want to know what it's like to be an illustrator for 50 years, this is what happened. So I'm still happy. I'm still doing it. I'm still an illustrator, freelance illustrator, book illustrator, with no plan B. And I will probably never retire. I like doing what I'm doing. And all I can say is thank God for Sesame Street, and thank God for my fantastic wife, who's had faith in me all this time. Thank you. I very rarely saw or met the author. It did several times. It's interesting why, but generally they kept us apart, probably for that very reason. But I was lucky because I had all this work. The the publisher would have the manuscript and schedule it for publication before I even got involved. By the time I saw it, it was scheduled for publication. They had the manuscript all printed up. They had the layouts done in some cases. And the author was really stuck with what I did. They could deal with the art director and the editor as I could, but we were both dealing with the publisher. We didn't fight with each other. They kept us apart, which I think was very wise. I did collaborate with an author. One was a very powerful author, so she insisted. And she was great. She just liked what I did, so it worked out fine. Another time it was a friend. We always swore we promised each other we'd write a book together. And we worked together on that, and that was fine too, but there was some bickering. There were some disagreements. I mean, that's the creative process. Basically that it's fun. I wanted it to be fun. I didn't want to take it too seriously. Oh, you know what I wanted to say too is that the book is the thing. The book is what's important. So when it came down to digital, working only on a computer, you don't have a finished piece. All you have is the book when it comes out. You skip that, and people would say to me, well, that's not right. How come you don't have a finished piece? Well, I'm not a painter. I'm not going to hang it on the wall anyway. So what sense does it make to take an illustration on paper and then scan it into a computer just to print it on book on paper again? It only needs to be on a paper once. But I also believe that a book doesn't have to be an expensive book to be a good book. I like to do some really nice, fancy Caldecott type, beautifully printed books. But if the kid can't touch it, it doesn't do much good. Or if only rich kids can afford it, it doesn't accomplish as much as it can, say, a nice cheap little, I think this was under $1 when it first came out. And if he tears a page out of it, or she, buy another book. But any kid in the world can afford it that way, and it's still high quality. And I guess I'd like to be remembered for that it was about the books and not necessarily an expensive book. Yeah, there's a certain quality to something that's vintage, just the fact that it's older. It evokes the 70s or something like that. I can appreciate that. I mean, sure, I drew it. I had bell bottoms on while I was drawing it. That's fine. Blue suede shoes. Eventually, I learned the rules. You know, I said I didn't know the rules, so things were a little wilder at the beginning. But I think the taste changed. You know, there's something else that changed over a period of time. When Sesame Street was, say, in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, we had a demographic in the audience of preschool, maybe 2 years old, to 2nd or 3rd grade. You know, it was tremendous. So we did all types of different books that got into emotions and all these things. When Will Lee died, Mr. Hooper, we actually came out with a book about his death. I think we were the first ones to do a kid's book about death. I illustrated that one. And later on, after cable TV came in, you had 800 channels. From what we used to have like 3 channels or something. So Sesame Street could come out with all this stuff. You took up half a store. You know, it was great. But when 800 channels came out with, I don't know how many kids shows, there was this much room for us in the store. And the demographic of the show, and there were so many channels on TV, the demographic is now just preschool. So it's we've been through a lot of changes in the last 50 years. And it's reflected in the style of art and everything, you know.
Your work.
I guess I'd have to say I had to evolve constantly. It really changed a lot over the years.
Can you describe it a little bit?
Well, when I was 4.
That's a good place to start.
Yeah. I probably peaked around there. Yeah, there was always something new to draw. I don't know, there's always something new. I mean, in a way, even the computer thing, it was a new challenge. It came with new things. You know, the new art directors, they never got a brown package, you know, wrapped by an artist from New England, an old coot in Massachusetts. they wouldn't know what to do with it. Once they open it up, they wouldn't be able to put it back together again to send it back for changes, and they don't have time for changes anyway. You get an email, can you please redo the sky or redo the building or whatever, and you've got to do it in 5 minutes and upload it again. Or make Elmo smaller. Well, that's magic unless you have a computer. So you're always being challenged by the latest look to be current and to keep alive. I thought, when the whole digital thing came around, that I would be retired prematurely, which a lot of guys and women were, by the way. Not everybody made that transition. It's like anything. No, we were out in the sticks where I was, and I don't know if there was anything like that in my time. You know, I over the years there were, in old times. I think the illustrators used to tend to be in New York. There was a Society of Illustrators, which I used to belong to, but I just didn't get in often enough, and after 20 years I finally dropped out. But it was fun to go to. I felt like a big shot, you know. Society of Illustrators. I think over the bar there was a Norman Rockwell and a Lion Decker at the other end of the dining room. You must know that place. But I love to get together. I love to go into New York and meet these people from time to time, but they're from all over the place. The one guy that's still active that I know, he's got a piece upstairs right now next to mine. Tom Brannon. He lives in Minneapolis or someplace. You know, like, what are you doing out there? But, you know, in this day and age, I guess it doesn't really matter. I think when I first started, it seemed important to me to be within at least striking distance of New York. But I didn't get together with other artists. I got together with the publishers and people like that. Oh, gee, I had a punchline I was going to use earlier. I forgot to use it. Remember the guy with the big hands, and he told me, who the heck do you think? He said, I got a Rolodex, and I can call Jack Davis. Well, if you go upstairs, my drawing is on the wall, and to the left of it is Jack Davis. And I forgot to... Well, am I glad we didn't go home without that one.